before I introduce you as the next speaker, in a moment, I just want to remind everyone.
Okay, can you all see my screen correctly? It should be a black screen with white writing on. I see some nods.
Amazing.
Great.
I just
go
want
then.
to remind everyone to.
I just want to start with this quote that's from Sir Alexander Fleming, and he said that he had a clue that there was something good, but he could not possibly know how good it was. And this is a quote from 1945, when he gave his speech after receiving the Nobel Prize for Medicine, along with two other people, a German biochemist and an Austrian scientist. But the story of why he received the world's most prestigious scientific prize started many years before, in 1928. And it also started with a mistake. He was a lot younger then than this photo shows, but he was a doctor and researcher at St. Mary's Hospital in London. And one day when he returned to his basement laboratory after going on holiday, he found an unwashed petri dish. And it was a plate of culture that he had actually just forgotten to wash before he went on holiday. It'd been contaminated by some kind of blue-green mold. And actually, when he looked closer, he noticed that the colonies of bacteria that were next to the mold were actually being dissolved. Now, he is a scientist, he's naturally curious, of course, so he decided to attempt to grow the mold in pure culture form. And from that, he was able to see that colonies of the bacteria were being destroyed by the mold, which was called penicillin notatum, I think, if my Latin is okay. And that proved, in principle at least, that the existence of an antibacterial agent, this could potentially exist. And he named this substance penicillin, which many of us will know, should know, and published his findings in 1929, noting that this discovery could someday have some kind of therapeutic value, and it could do that if we could produce it in enough quantity, but it would be years before Fleming's findings would actually be put into practical widespread use. But by making this mistake of not washing his dishes before he went on holiday, Fleming essentially discovered the world's first antibiotic drug. Now, while I certainly have made the mistake of not washing the dishes, I have yet to discover a life-saving drug. I do, however, try my very best to do what I can to help the most animals that I can. And while doing so, I have certainly made many mistakes. I'm also completely sure that I will continue to make mistakes for the rest of my life. So today, I'd just like to share some of those mistakes with you. And I want to encourage you all to see your own mistakes as opportunities to learn and to grow as activists and as people. Now, for those of you who don't know me already, which is quite a lot of you, I'm Kirsty. I live in France. That's where I'm presenting to you from today. I'm the acting CEO of Anima International, and Anima International is a Europe-wide organisation made up of 10 groups in 10 different countries. I'm also co-founder of Assiette Végétale, which is the French group of Anima International. Now, the earliest mistake that I made, that I can remember at least, I'm sure I made many before this point, but it happened to me when I was about this age. It's something that was about something that is still very important to me, and that is cookies. I was at school, and one day we were baking cookies together in class. And I was so excited by the idea of eating cookies that I could not wait for them to be ready. I wanted to see for myself how close I was to that moment where I could eat the cookies. So what did I do? I decided to go over and look into the oven. I put my hands onto the oven door and tried to peer inside as closely as possible. I don't know if you know this, but ovens are quite hot. So I came away from the oven having burned the insides of all my hand. And also I had a big burn on my lip from pushing it so much into the oven to look inside. Now, I don't even remember if I got to eat a cookie at the end of this. What I do remember is this was a mistake, and I definitely learned patience on this day. Now, if we can fast forward about 20 years, I can share another embarrassing mistake with you. Now, this photo it's taken an action that I did, that I helped organize at the Spanish Parliament that was against bullfighting. Now, we could actually spend a while debating whether my choice of hairstyle was also a mistake. I'm not sure about that yet. But one mistake that I definitely made was how I was greeting the Spanish politicians during this important official event. I hadn't moved to France yet, so I wasn't aware that in countries like France and Spain, when you greet someone, you are supposed to fake kiss them on the cheek. Now, it's not a real kiss. I'm sure many of you already know this, but I didn't. You don't actually kiss them. You simply touch cheeks and make the sound as if you're kissing them. I also didn't know which cheek to start with. So what I actually ended up doing, of course, was usually picking the wrong side to go to first and essentially trying to kiss lots of politicians on the lips. They must have thought that I was extremely friendly, especially for an English woman. But it was here that I learned the lesson of cultural context and knowing the culture that you're in, or talking to at least. And finally, some of you may remember my talk at last year's CARE conference. Obviously, this is in a very different context to the one we have today. During my talk, I was talking about something called grit, and grit is basically some kind of resilience. It could be described in this way. I sincerely hope some of you found it a useful talk. I thought it was also interesting, but I was particularly interested when one of my colleagues sent me this random message about 5 months after I gave the talk. Now, while I still am proud of the talk that I give, apparently some of the science has been highlighted as quite questionable. So I'm really hoping that after my talk this year, the science of penicillin is not going to be proven wrong. Now, these 3 examples are just 3 small mistakes that I've made in the past, from cookies to politicians to giving speeches. Everyone makes mistakes. So now I'd like to talk in more detail about some of the bigger mistakes that I believe that I've made and what we can all potentially learn from them. So throughout the decade of Fleming's discovery of penicillin, many other scientists invested heavily in research and clinical trials designed to prove the effectiveness and to scale up the production of penicillin. But it actually wasn't until the Normandy landings during World War II that there was actually enough supply of the drug to actually make any meaningful difference to the world or to treat any of the casualties. So if we think of it this way, he'd already made this discovery, but even he couldn't change the world alone. Neither can I, and neither can you. And yet I've spent a surprisingly long amount of time, especially as my animal advocate career, we could say, believing that I could do it alone, or at least maybe I didn't acknowledge that, but it was there in the back of my mind. And not only did this make me less effective in my work, but it allowed me to put extra pressure on myself, creating more stress. If you just think about that for a moment, if you genuinely believe that you have the power to change the world without the help of others, that is a lot of unnecessary pressure that you're putting on yourself. Like, for example, I remember when I decided to leave one of my previous jobs because I wanted to move to France. And it was incredibly difficult to do it because I had somehow convinced myself that I was very much needed, that people really relied on me. And to an extent, it was true, but actually it came as a shock and a huge relief after I left. And I saw that the animal rights world actually didn't fall apart. It kept turning quite well without me. So you should definitely see this as a positive as well. Whether you get involved in animal advocacy or not, whether you already are, the world will go on. This might seem counterintuitive because, of course, I want all of you to be involved, but I do think that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to always be on, to always be doing more, because if we don't, then animals will continue to suffer. But sometimes it is just useful to remember that we are just specks of dust in a vast universe. And yeah, over the years, it has become clear to me that not only would the world keep turning if I wasn't involved, but my impact will be severely limited if I don't work with others. So to put that lesson that I've learned from this mistake simply, we only stand a chance of making change for animals if we do this together. Now, I also read quite a lot about Stoicism, about psychology and relationships. I'm someone, I think, who is quite, in general, quite anxious and can often take things personally. And by that, I mean, if things are going badly in a team that I work in, or we aren't winning a specific campaign, I tend to internalize that and think that it's my fault. Probably sometimes it is my fault. But I often worry a lot about what people think about me. It's useful, though, to remember that most of the time, people are not thinking about you. It's probably hard to admit, but usually, and in fact, rarely, are we the center of someone's universe. People are almost always thinking about themselves and how they are perceived and their own problems. They don't have the time to think about you. So one of the biggest mistakes that I've made thinking back is one that I still often make, and that is assuming that everyone has the same reality. If I'm thinking about something I did, which I perceive as a failure, then everyone else must be thinking that too, right? But people don't see things the same as I do. People have their own problems to worry about. And most of the time, I know nothing about someone's life. And this realization can become very useful as an animal activist. Just because we know and understand that factory farming is cruelty to animals, that doesn't mean that the person in the street is going to know and understand when you tell them what you want them to know. Their personality and their life has been shaped completely differently to yours. What we know to be true, or what we see as reality, is very different to what someone else sees as reality. And for this reason, it is often more effective to talk to people if we can somehow talk to them in their own reality. Instead of staying in our own bubbles and trying to shout across to them into their bubble about what the truth is, I truly believe that we should make the sometimes uncomfortable effort to enter into their bubble before we talk to them. If we can frame things in a way that will make sense to their reality, then we have a much better chance of understanding them and of being understood ourselves. So, for example, If you were in a high stakes corporate outreach meeting and you're trying to convince, I don't know, a huge international company to go cage free, conducting the meeting in your own reality probably won't be very successful. And not that long ago, I was in a similar meeting as this. It wasn't about cage free, it was in France. And I now realize that I talk to people I was in the meeting with only thinking about myself and my own goals. I pushed them on facts and I kept asking them, okay, so when are you going to commit? Hoping to pressure them into saying yes. And that was even though I could feel that they didn't want to do it. But in this case, they weakly agreed to what I wanted, and then we never heard from them again. I made a lot of mistakes in this meeting, and what I should have done, looking back, is I should have met them in their own reality and realized that they have different goals and problems to mine. I should have taken into account the fact that the manager that I was talking to had just told me that even if he wanted to implement daily vegan options in all his canteens, there would be an uprising from all his chefs if he did it. I should have sensed that he didn't want to feel pressured into something and that he didn't feel like he could commit. And instead of pushing to hear a yes, which in this case was meaningless anyway, I should have asked him how we could help to solve his problems. Now, most people, myself included, tend to see making mistakes as a failure. The two are so deeply intertwined that I'd just like to say that again. We think that mistakes are automatically failures, but the two shouldn't necessarily be seen as exactly the same thing. I think for sure that there are overlapping aspects, and making a mistake could have some negative consequences, for example, which may make us feel like what we've done is a failure. But they're not the same thing. I was just thinking about this speech and I remembered something that happened to me a long time ago when I was much younger, when I was completing my A levels, which is essentially the exams that you need to do to enter university in England. I didn't get the grades that I wanted, and it wasn't enough to actually get into the university that I wanted to attend. I was only about 3 points away from what I actually needed, and yet I was refused entry. And despite the fact that those 3 points told me nothing about my level of intelligence or ability to complete a degree at any university, I took the news very badly and told myself that I was a failure. The 3 extra points meant that I had to take a different path, which at the time upset me a lot because I believed that I was now taking the wrong path. But I went to a different university, I did the same degree, and eventually I graduated to go on to study a postgraduate degree in the exact original university that I had wanted to go to. That had been my plan all along. So despite taking a different path than planned, I ended up going in exactly the same destination. Now, I didn't get the 3 extra points that I needed because I made some mistakes in the entrance exams, but it didn't mean that what I had done was a failure. We have this tendency, I think, that when something goes wrong because of our actions, but it's almost actually always because of a lot of things combined. There is nothing entirely under your control. Always accepting this and preparing yourself in advance to meet both success and failure while staying calm can help you avoid feeling angry, surprised, frustrated when events don't turn out exactly the way that you want them to. And it can also stop you from worrying about things in anticipation for when they will go wrong. And this made me think of when Christians would often write the letters DV at the end of, at the end of one of their letters when they were sending news to someone. And this meant Deo volente, which is Latin for God willing. That underlying that everything they write in their letters is not completely up to them to decide, but that there are a lot of outside forces also at play. And if I can keep in the theme of Christianity for a second, I thought this quote from the New Testament was also very useful, where it says, "Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know." I'll start that again. Why? You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. So that brings me to the end of this section that makes me think very often we aren't faced with the choice of doing something that is either right or something that is wrong. I often become worried when I'm trying to figure out which path I must take and which is the correct one. But this belief that we can make a right or wrong choice is, I think at least, the source of a lot of unneeded worry and stress in the world. But when we realize that both the paths are simply different paths, both are wrong and both are right, then choosing and actually walking down the road is usually less daunting. And let's not forget that had Alexander Fleming simply seen his mistake of not washing his dishes as a failure to tidy up, he never would have had the curiosity to look closer and to discover that something that has changed the world and saved countless lives. Now, in Anima International, which is the organization I work with, we have an internal Slack channel that is called the Failure Wall. And it's where we encourage each other to openly post about mistakes that we've made. And actually, while writing this speech, I realized that when I created the channel, I made a mistake because I named it Failure Wall and I should probably rename it to Mistakes. But I asked some of my colleagues in this channel to share some of their mistakes as activists so that they, right now I've got some light-hearted first-hand experience for you. So one of my colleagues told me that it's probably best if you don't wear see-through clothes when co-hosting a conference in your country's parliament about factory farming. It's also probably a good idea if you're protesting to get the attention of one specific person, like someone who's very important in a company, for example. You should probably check what that person looks like before you do the protest. And one other person said, if you've got a meeting with a corporate outreach team and you're trying to convince a company to do something, try not to drink a lot of water before you go into the meeting, because all you'll do is think about going to the toilet rather than convincing them how to go cage-free. And finally, when you do protests, make sure that you put your chicken mask on the right way. I still laugh at this picture. So to end my talk, I would just like to share again what I wanted to achieve with it. I wanted to encourage others to not be scared of making mistakes. I want you all to know that everyone makes them. And it's hard and to not feel bad when we do, because we're going to do that. But one important thing is that it is possible to learn and to grow from them. And it's also possible to improve how much you are able to do that. Here are some resources that I think could be useful if this is something that interests you. The first is a book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. It's about the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, and in general it focuses on Stoicism, how you can use that in your everyday life to generally be more mindful, to worry less, be less anxious, and to accept that mistakes are part of life. The book actually also uses quite a lot of cognitive therapy techniques as well. So it's really, really interesting. The second thing is meditation. It's something I'm really not good at, but I try and do it most days. And that can also be a very good area that you can work on accepting mistakes and letting them go. And finally, the last one is a book that I read when I specifically wanted to learn more about negotiation and talking to companies, for example. So while it is mainly about negotiations and persuasion, I think even if you don't do corporate outreach, I would recommend you read it, because I think it can really help anyone to learn about human relationships, and especially this aspect of talking to people as them rather than thinking everyone feels the same as you. So it's about this finding other people's realities and meeting them halfway. And so I would just want to come back to this quote from Sir Alexander Fleming from the start of my talk. And now that you've heard about some of my mistakes, I'd like you to read it again, because he says, "I had a clue that there was something good, but I could not possibly know how good it was." And our mistakes can be embarrassing, they can be painful, and sometimes they might result in negative consequences. But I would argue that in all of our mistakes, we can find something good in them. We just need to look for it. Now that's it, but I think we do have time. If anyone has any questions or comments, I can stick around for a while.
Okay, Kirsty, thank you for your amazing presentation. And yeah, we have 21 minutes left.
Oh, so... Bianca, I can see you're talking, but I can't hear you, which is strange. Can everyone else? Oh, okay. Well, it's just me.
Can you hear me?
I can't hear anyone. Let me try and take my microphone off.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So I was just basically saying that we have 21 minutes left, and that, yeah, as you said, that it's time for questions. So I've seen one question in Slido right now, and I'd like to encourage everybody in this room, if you have any question that you'd like to ask Kirsty, you can use the link that is mentioned down below in the group chat and ask anything you want. So let's read the first question. The first question is from Vishnya. It's, so you want to say that we need to listen to them, and by that she meant when the people, when you talked about
different realities and
yeah, I meant that. Yeah. Them to hear them first, and then to adapt our response to be closer to them in order to get to hear us.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is very important to listen to others, but I think what I wanted to explain, it is quite complicated, but it's almost more than just listening to them. We have to really understand where they are coming from. I think it's very useful to sometimes even if someone is being rude to you, or they're, I don't know, the president of a company that kills millions of animals, I can understand, and I often am, you want to be angry with this person, or you want to tell them that what they're doing makes no sense and that it would be better for their business if they did what you wanted. But it's almost like you want to understand how they have got to where they are today. And when you realize, okay, well, this person, for example, well, their parents push them to go to business school. They're under a lot of pressure to show that they're successful. They don't want to come across as being weak. You can understand then why he's being a bit rude in the meeting, or why he's refusing so far to commit to things. And usually that would, at the very least, help you to be more calm and not take it personally that this person has got a problem with you, that it's actually about their life. That's why they're acting the way that they are. But hopefully by doing that and listening to them again, you can probably find a different tactic, or I don't know, change slightly the strategy to help them see that what you're proposing will also meet their aims as well. I hope that explained it a bit further.
Yeah, thanks. Let's move on to the next question from Mathilde. Thanks for this wonderful talk, Kirsty. And do you have any thoughts on thinking about unintended harm in an organization strategy when making decisions?
It sounds quite obvious to say, but I think if you've got a strategy that you think looks good and you've at least attempted to think of possible things that go wrong, and that's actually another strategy that is recommended by like stoicism and stoics, that quite often to avoid anxiety you would imagine in advance everything that could possibly go wrong, because then you've like dealt with the pain before it arrives. As long as you've thought about everything, there is no possible way that you can plan for everything that could go wrong. If you've got rid of all of the obvious ones and you have plans for if that does happen, I almost want to say that because you can't plan for everything to go wrong, I would say do it anyway. And that if you do encounter problems, then you deal with them when they arise. It would probably be less effective if you, rather than the potential of doing harm, if you just didn't decide to do anything. And yeah, it brings me back to this, that usually done is better than perfect. And as long as you can deal with the usual things or potential things that could arise, I would encourage everyone to try not to worry too much about, I don't know, the earthquake that could happen during the protest, or, you know, one of your team members getting very sick, because the world we live in, everything could go wrong at any time. Yeah, and just try to deal with it as best you can if it does arise.
Yeah, thank you. And I also agree, like, you can't plan everything that is going to happen.
Yeah, but it reminds me of when I used to organize a lot of protests. That was part of one of my jobs when I was younger, and I would plan the protest, and then I would actually have a sheet of paper where I'd write what I could imagine going wrong and what I would do if that happened. But I never sat there and wrote what will happen if my house burns down the night before. It would usually be things like, what happens if it rains? What happens if people don't turn up? What happens if the police come? So it's like, I definitely think people should plan for things that could happen, but other things that are genuinely out of your control, just don't worry about them and just be prepared to act in the best way you can if they do.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And the next question is, I like the idea of the Slack channel. Do you have any other suggestions for encouraging colleagues to talk more freely about mistakes?
I think that will come, it's not something that comes immediately or easily, and it's not going to happen if you just tell people, let's share our mistakes. People need to feel safe in order to do that. And for sure, one of my colleagues, Anya, she had a talk on Friday at this conference about psychological safety. And I think that is very much needed in order for people to share mistakes, because it is people being vulnerable and opening up. It is difficult to share mistakes and admit when you've made them or done something wrong. I think one thing that can go quite far to helping that is for managers or leadership to do it first, to show that, okay, everyone in the organization makes mistakes. It's not just people who have just started with their activism. It's everyone from, you know, the social media coordinator to the CEO can make mistakes and do quite often. So I think that probably it could help for the leadership to take the lead in this way. But also, yeah, just having a general culture of feeling safe with your colleagues. And yeah, I think that was probably the two things I would recommend.
Thank you. The next question is also anonymous. In this era of social media, lots of mistakes are made publicly and are seen by so many. How can we ensure people still take risks when the stakes are so high?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea for people to always be thinking, especially on social media, but any time, that when they're talking, that they need to be aware that people are reading what they say. And especially online, I feel like sentiments and what people mean can often come across in different ways. Like, you don't see the person face to face. You quite often don't know what the person is like behind the screen. So it can sometimes be possible to take things badly just because it's online, for sure. So I think if you keep that in mind, that what you're writing has to be extremely clear, and that you don't want to hurt people. I think that should also be at the base of everything we do, that if you're assuming that, okay, I'm writing this, but it needs to be written in a way that ensures I don't harm others, or that people don't feel harmed by what I'm writing. I think that could go some way to solving this. To an extent as well, if you need to talk about something that, I don't know, that you feel is controversial, or that other people may want to say in as well, probably online is not a good idea. Usually difficult conversations, or just in-depth conversations, and with people that you don't know, it's probably going to be better to do that on a call, or even better face-to-face, so that you can actually feel each other and feel each other's reactions. So that's not me saying that I hate Facebook and Twitter and all social media platforms, but just, it sounds kind of obvious and to an extent common sense, that you can really have a much better discussion face to face. I mean, I know we're doing this conference online this year, but I do, and it's been great, but there is a certain, relationship building that we miss by not being in a room together. And I think that's something that we should certainly remember.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. And we have 2 more questions on Slido. So if you haven't asked your questions yet, now's the time. The next question is, how can your reaction be when people attack you on social media against something that you're defending? Also, another animal groups are against you.
Could you say that question again?
Yeah, sure. How can your reaction be when people attack you on social media against something that you are defending? Also, another animal groups are against you.
Okay. Well, I think there's not a lot of detail to the question, but I can offer some kind of vague answer. I think probably I would say take a step back from social media. You don't need to have debates in public. I personally think that, like, as I just mentioned, that if there is a controversy, or there's a discussion that needs to be had, or that you think is important, or even if people are attacking you, I'm not convinced that online is the best place to have that discussion for the reasons that I've just mentioned. So I don't know, if I was in such a position, I would probably step back from the platform and see if there's a way that I can actually solve it, can we say, in real life. That seems like it's probably going to be more efficient. And I don't know, I feel like talking online, you can probably more easily read into things or take things in a different direction. Whereas one-on-one, especially in person, it's a lot harder to do that. So that's probably what I would suggest.
Okay, and the last question is, what do you think about having a document where everyone writes about their mistakes?
Well, it sounds cool to me. Like, I don't know if you would need to record them or save them for years to come, but having some place where people can talk about them, maybe even analyze what went wrong, seems like a very good idea to me. So that's exactly what we try to do with the Slack channel in Anima International called Failure Wall, just to share vulnerability and have a laugh when things go wrong. I would also suggest that when you're doing projects, probably I would be shocked if after every project that we work on, there isn't at least one mistake that we could have learned from. So having some kind of debrief after a project, particularly big ones, seems like a very good idea. That I feel like often we finish a project or a task and we move immediately on to the next one rather than taking the time to reflect and learn from them. I remember in one of my previous jobs that after every single protest, I would write, I can't remember the name of the document now, but a debrief summary of what happened, how we did it, what went wrong, and how we can actually improve it next time. Not only was that good for me to learn from it, but people, after I left the organization, if someone else had to do a similar demo, they could look into my document and see, oh, actually by wearing this costume, it was really difficult to do this other thing, so we should do it in a different way. So yeah, in general, I'm really for writing down mistakes and analyzing them for sure.
Okay, and there is one more, not quite question, but it's from Vishnya. I just want to say this presentation was very motivational for me and helps me keep my optimism and maybe forgive myself for some mistakes and failures. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased because that was exactly my aim. I know that animal activism is extremely hard. It can be very draining for people. And, you know, because we all know that it is so important, I know for sure that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. So let's not add to that pressure by thinking we need to be perfect and that we should never make mistakes. Like the biggest mistake that we can make is by not continuing. Because yeah, the animals need us, so.
Okay, and we have 5 minutes left, so if anyone has any kind of question that you would like to ask, you can use Slido. And for now, I'd like to thank you for your amazing presentation and for all of your advice, because sometimes I also see mistakes as failures, and I know that I have to divide those two.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really difficult, yeah, to not see mistakes like failures, but like see mistakes as a part of life and learn from them.
For sure. Like I've seen while we've been talking, a lot of people putting their little hand up in the Zoom windows. Maybe they're not writing on Slido though, but I saw Marta, Nikita, I saw Maddie Do.
I was clapping.
Oh, it's a clap. I thought you were all putting your hands up to say something. Okay, very nice. Well, that's another mistake. And if I may just share one final mistake with you all. I actually wrote this speech this afternoon, so that's definitely something I do not advise you do. Cool. Well, I think that's it then. We should probably call it a day there. Well, thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you especially for joining, and also have a nice day.
Yeah. Have a nice day, everyone. See you in the next talks.